My name is Laura Bjorg, and I'm the manager of Protected Areas Section with Ontario Parks. And I have the pleasure of welcoming you here this morning. It's so nice to see people, and for those of you in person and joining online as well. For those of you that are attending here in Peterborough, I want to acknowledge that we are located on the lands within the geographic boundary of Treaty 20 and the Mississauga Territory in the traditional territory of the Mississauga and Chippewa Nations, collectively known as the Williams Treaties First Nations. The Williams Treaties First Nations have protected and managed these lands from time immemorial and continue to shape them today, and I want to show my respect. I am conscious of the dark history of many of protected areas in Ontario, and I am committed in my daily work to uphold the spirit of reconciliation. As we explore today's topic of decision-making and planning in protected areas, I encourage you to recognize the contributions of Indigenous peoples, past, present, and future, as I do in my daily life. Casiopa is a valued research network in Ontario, and I want to thank Steve and his team for their support to plan and deliver today's conference. The conference is sponsored through a 3-year agreement with the University of Waterloo to facilitate collaboration among protected area practitioners, researchers, and that contribute to science-based policy planning and management in protected areas in Ontario. It's so nice to be back together again. So whether here in person or joining virtually, I wish you an enjoyable day of learning and connection. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
And thank you again, Laura. As Laura said, it's actually very nice to be back in person. Our first speaker, without further ado, is Elizabeth Halfpenny. She is going to spellbind us, to inform us, to blow us away, actually. And I will get off the stage and let her take over. Liz.
Thanks very much, Stephen. And thank you all for inviting me to come across the country to beautiful Ontario. I get to reconnect with my roots again. I grew up in Eastern Ontario near Perth. And so it's been a delight to see the fall colors again. Although we are having fantastic weather in Alberta too. I'm just going to move the mic up a little bit and tell me if there's any problems with volume. Yeah, I am a social scientist working at the University of Alberta. And I've been based out there about 17 years, sorry now. Woo, yeah, 17. And over the years, I've been blessed to work with great park agency partners, but in particular, I'll do a shout out today to Alberta Parks, who have partnered with us many times over the years. And when I say us, I'm talking about researchers such as Glenn Vinegard, who's based at Augustana, many of my graduate students as well, on park-related research projects in the province. I'm working with Parks Canada as well, but today most of my ideas are coming from the pieces. My abstract talks about using environmental communications as a tool to promote advocacy. And so that's what I'm going to focus on. I'm going to reflect on experiences working with practitioner agencies in the province of Alberta, but also drawing on, more importantly, I think, observations that are documented in research, broadly speaking. So different disciplines such as education, conservation biology, environmental psychology, and trying to pull in all of the sort of comprehensive reviews or systematic reviews that we've been starting to engage in over the past decade that examine specifically what makes environmental communication work and what seems to be trending currently towards more proactive, more effective ways of converting visitors to engage in park supportive action, and I'll get into that in a second. So I acknowledge first and foremost here that there are many stakeholders and right holders that we want to work with as park agencies. And I'm going to keep talking and make sure the audio is working well. But today I want to focus my presentation on visitors and how we communicate with them, how we take opportunities through their visit to encourage them to visit parks in an appropriate manner, in an environmentally responsible manner, but also in taking those lessons home to their everyday lives and perhaps engaging in pro-conservation and pro-environmental behaviors going forward. So I wanted to just take a minute because I don't know exactly who's on the phone. I've seen a full participant list. I know we have a chat box in our interface that you're all looking at. Teams. I would love to see a vote here, an indication. Generally, I would love to find out how many people work on the ground jobs, interfaces with either, conservation biology initiatives or integrity initiatives on nature-based science kind of focused issues, or people on the ground as they visit the park, so visitors. But I'd like to know who's working on the ground and who is working in offices somewhere else in the ether. So maybe if the chat would just reflect that, if you just type in right now, I work primarily on the ground with people or plants or animals, or I work primarily in HQ and office settings, because I'd like to know what kind of framing might be useful in this. And so maybe you can see who else is on the line then as well, as each of us, except for me, can see the chat right now. I'm operating in a vacuum here. I feel like I'm in the classroom already. You can't see anything in the classroom. Are we seeing some responses of who's in the chat and what they do? While they give me some, good. Well, you can collate it for me. I'll let you collate it for a minute there, Stephen, and I'll keep going, okay? Because I just would love to hear about that. All right. So the next slide, the slide next now. Yeah. So I'm going to focus on primarily this idea of highlighting recent research findings that point to the methods that are most effective or seem to be most effective at supporting pro-conservation and behaviors and maybe changing environmental attitudes. So I'm going to focus in on non-personal and personal interpretation in particular. So you can see examples here. I was just in Joggins World Heritage Site last week. The picture with the woman looking at the fossil there in our hard hats. And then an example of non-personal would be this signage that you see for Leave No Trace and the other illustration. And as I mentioned before, I'm going to be drawing from these about 6 or 7 or 8 key kind of comprehensive reviews have been published in the last 10 years that actually do a great job of sort of collating this information of what seems to be working and where we should be investing maybe our limited resources when it comes to programming for visitors. What could we be doing better at the agency level? And then certainly as researchers then, us, I'm pointing at myself, what kinds of questions should we be asking to improve better measures of these outcomes? The different variables that affect how we support and encourage and inspire pro-environmental behavior. The best techniques for measuring that, I should say. Right, next slide, please. This slide, I picked out 2 key features because I wanted to highlight what we want to focus when people are visiting parks and we want to encourage pro-environmental behaviors. There's a lot of different avenues you can explore. You can think about, well, what are the most important issues for us at our parks? Is it ecological integrity and the massive numbers of people that we've been experiencing over the past couple of years, especially visitation, and how do we mitigate those impacts of over-visitation? Or is it you want to emphasize important issues that are related to visitor experience and visitor activities and how the activities of some visitors create conflict or deteriorate the experience of other visitors. So that's more of a pro-social kind of experience mitigation focus. And then the other issue that you might want to instead think bigger, and I encourage us all to think bigger in this room today, is to think about the really complex issues that are facing us, things like climate change. How do we have great conversations with visitors about climate change and foster actions outside the park going forward amongst those visitors? So the column on the next slide, please. Thanks. The column on the right side of your screen just thinks about pro-park, pro-environment generally, pro-agency. I didn't mention that. How do we foster advocates within our public that support our agency, sites that we're protecting? And then finally, just generally conservation behaviors. But on the left side of the screen, no, sorry, and it's your right, my apologies, is labeled individual impacts. So from a researcher standpoint, and here my training comes through as an environmental psychology person who looks at behavior and how we try to shift behaviors. I try to think about target outcomes that we want to impact. What do we want to change inside as they visit our parks? And of course, long time, we've often, and I put it on the list here, in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, it was information provision. We wanted people to gain knowledge, but we know that that is not enough, simply not enough to just provide knowledge to visitors. We need to transform their attitudes about particular elements within the environment. We need to think and also be really creative about how we create a sense of connection, generate emotion amongst visitors for the things that they're visiting, a sense of empathy. So I'll get into that in a few minutes. And then, of course, we have this full tension of whenever we're, I'm going to put my researcher hat on here for a minute. When we're thinking, we're measuring often people's intentions to do better in the future, stay on the paths in the future. I'm going to pick up my literature, or I'm going to donate to this conservation program in the future. And that's the easy thing for us to do, just behavioralists and researchers. But ultimately, we need better funding and more rigorous research designs to study behaviors. And so that's approaches like hiding in the woods and watching your visitors go up that trail and make sure that they keep their dog on leash, or that is following up. And with 6 months to a year later with interviews with them, quick, short surveys perhaps, to find out if they're actually engaging in the things they promised to do. That takes money, that takes time. But I do want us to commit to that. All right, moving forward. Let me get into the meat of it here. So environmental communications. You're having still some trouble? Shall I do this from far away? Okay. No problem. How's this? Testing, 1, 2, 3. Awesome, good, thank you. So I suspect, I'm guessing, so let me get my poll here. How many people are working in the field and how many people are sort of in the office, generally speaking? Have we got a half and half split here? Okay, so both people wearing both hats and sort of half and half on the field and office thing. I'd be curious also then in your chats, just so you're feeling engaged at home and in your offices right now, as if you're working in environmental communication or interpretation or any sort of visitor experience elements, say, yeah, I do that. And we'll do a little count of that too, okay? As I suspect, I don't know who I'm talking to here, but I suspect maybe there'll be some people who are very familiar with these definitions. So when I'm talking about environmental communications, I'm thinking about how we influence behaviors through tools such as, words, symbols, language, visuals. We are involved in environmental communications consciously and unconsciously in our everyday life. And this can be formal, for example, through classes, or informal, such as a sign that a person stumbles across when they're hiking. And certainly we've been using environmental communications at parks for a long time in various formats, such as exhibits, interpretive programs, guided hikes, theatrical shows, and now more recently, electronic guides and social media. And it's a way we would provide people with information on what, but we also want to move forward and really attend to the process that optimizes how people think and understand and feel about the environments that they're visiting. And then relatedly, is these issues, these bigger issues that affect those environments that they're visiting. So we have lots of calls out for better, more effective delivery techniques in our field of environmental communications. And so I want to just jump into what some of those best practices are that we're starting to identify. One thing I wanted to highlight, though, maybe you've heard of this term, free choice learning environments. So free choice learning environments are places like parks where you're coming as a visitor. You're freely chosen to come to that park as a visitor and enjoy your recreational time. It's leisure time. And really, these are important environments in that when people are engaged in free choice visitation and free choice learning, they tend to pick up knowledge quicker. They kind of absorb it like sponges. And they're suggesting that an estimated as much as 97% of our understanding of nature and the environment is gained through free choice environments. So when we're playing as children in the back, yard, that's a free choice learning environment, for example. So really important context to capitalize on as park managers. Sorry, I'm probably running slow here, so I'm going to move to the next slide. So next slide is, this is I'll promise not to show too many charts and slides here like this, but this one I wanted to highlight. This is a study that we recently completed and published, and it's a review of 54 empirical studies that were published in English language journals. And they're all focused on interventions and how effective those interventions were in fostering pro-environmental behavior. So they're communication studies, how people, largely park agencies, use communication to change behavior. So a few things I wanted to point out here. And largely, again, these are Western countries, so Australia, New Zealand, UK, US, that sort of thing. So I wanted to highlight a couple of things here, and I can't see this map super well on my screen, so I'm just going to highlight. It's broken down into several different categories. The use of artwork as a technique to communicate to people, the use of post-visit action resources, which I'll get to in a few slides from now, the importance of that as a technique. But you can see predominantly the most common uses of environmental communication or venues for that are personal interpretation, so that's when you're listening to park interpreters, and non-personal tools such as signage. So this is only the techniques that were used in these 54 studies. We looked at 1,000 or more publications, but we whittled them down to studies that only looked at they actually measured post-visit changes, right? So there's an intervention, some sort of communications approach, and then post-visit outcomes. So that's what we've come up with. So I just wanted to highlight this graph talks about how the purple, there was no effect. They documented, it's not a failed experiment. It's just there was no positive outcome, no major effect. Yellow there was mixed effects. Some of their techniques seemed to have effect, and some of them did not. So if they used both signage and personal interpretation simultaneously, they had these mixed results. But the green spaces are the things where we want to focus on, and you can see that predominantly the most common form of interpretation used in these studies was in personal interpretation, so that communication back and forth, number one, which is not uncommon. It has been sort of demonstrated that is an incredibly effective form of environmental communication because there's that back and forth, and interpreters will use a fancy term called dialogic interpretation, where you're having dialogues back and forth with the person that you're talking to. That's an incredibly important and useful approach. So the green indicates that there was much more positive outcomes or changes arising from those particular approaches. I think I'd like to next dive deeper into these specific approaches, just to highlight a few. How are we doing for time, Stephen? Have you?
You're at 9:08.
9:08. Okay. I won't rush so much. Okay. So digging down, the first one I just want to highlight is personal interpretation. And I'm just going to look in the room this time and survey. When's the last time anybody not had a personal interpretation experience before at a park? No, right? But think back now, and those of you in our virtual meeting environment as well, the last time you had a personal interpretation experience, was it moving, and what made it moving what about that experience made it moving for you? Was it that you were taking your grandchild for the first time to an interpretive program and sharing that experience with them? Was it singing songs in a group or acting out crazy skits on the stage with the park interpreters and feeling like a fool, but also feeling young again and excited about the planet? These things are enabled by in-person interpretation. So one of the key elements that we can do with personal interpretation is inspire and invoke and provoke people, because you have these ongoing conversations. You can use humor and a lot of different interesting delivery mechanisms to keep it fresh and lively. So interpretive programs, these kinds of impersonal programs enhance experiences and enjoyment of visitors. We know that from the literature. It increases their knowledge, which we've talked about, but also their understanding of cultural and heritage and natural resources. They also can foster a sense of appreciation about those resources and promote stewardship behaviors. So this is the key. We know that it's time and again, it's definitely illustrates that. But they're really good also at making a sales pitch or advocating for people to take action when they leave the parks as well. The next slide, please. So non-personal interpretation. We know this is still working. This is a good budget option. So when we're pricing out and the expenses of trying to figure out where we invest our money, in resources for environmental communication, we know that signage is more affordable, but it is a long-term investment too. So we need to think about thoughtfully about what we're placing on that signage. I know we've lost some video for the presentation, but I'm going to keep going because I know we have a time limit. On the screen, if you see it online, you would see two boards. One board is a site-specific board, and I've chosen that specifically. It talks about the meadows and restoring ecological habitat in Edith Cavell, in a popular hiking destination in Jasper National Park. I chose this sandwich board, or this signage, because it highlights one of the important findings we've identified in the literature, which is we need to articulate in our environmental communications how your actions as a visitor benefits specific elements of the park you're visiting. So the benefits to the trail, to the natural area. So for example, minimizing your campfire will reduce the risk of forest fires, making that connection, that the long-term goal of what we're trying to do. Or practicing bear-aware behaviors will protect bears just as much as humans. So I guess, yeah, that's what I want to highlight with that one, is that we want to be very specific about the outcomes. What's the benefit of doing this? Not just say, stay on the trail. It's just stay on the trail. Why? Because it's going to benefit the vegetation that we're visiting. Okay, next slide. Thank you. Tailored actions versus general behaviors. So an interesting study that we completed, and it was my master's student, CJ Bly, who finished this a few years ago now, but she was fortunate enough to collect data both in Algonquin Provincial Park and also in Kaneska's country at some of the parks in that complex in Alberta. And she was examining the efficacy or the effectiveness of leave no trace messaging. So I know that Ontario Parks, at least at that point in time, had a partnership with Leave No Trace and was messaging around these kind of 7 principles, which, I mean, an interesting finding from her study, whereas, the Alberta Parks does not have a formal relationship, so they can't use those terms. They can't use the branding, they can't use the terminology, but they communicate with their visitors in a slightly different fashion. And it turned out there was a difference there in the findings of CJ's results. She found that, it could be a sampling thing. It could be just the characteristics of the visitors in the different provinces and their level of knowledge and their practice of these behaviors. But she found that the more general messaging, the leave no trace messaging, was less effective, or seemed to communicate less to those visitors that she surveyed, versus the very specific messaging around bear aware or those sorts of practices that the Alberta Parks visitors were getting. So that was a fascinating result. Now that's just one study, but I wanted to use that study to amplify a larger message that seems to be broadly observed in the literature now, which is this: they want to advocate for very tailored messaging to the ecological issue that you're trying to deal with, rather than these more, big picture kind of ideas. And we had trouble with using these ideas. We were testing the efficacy of these ideas. So for example, making noise on a trail is sort of dissuaded by leave no trace, generally speaking, but you cannot do that in Alberta. I mean, that is a no-no. You want to do the exact opposite if you want to not be dinner for somebody. So, I mean, those sorts of differences are kind of contextually, I guess that's the point I'm trying to make with this slide. You need to be contextually specific to be effective. Right, next slide. Is a picture of anybody, you know, gold star, anybody who knows who this guy is on the upper right of the screen with his hat, and he's hanging out with a bison. His team won last night in hockey. So I don't expect you to know. This is Jesse Puljujärvi, who plays for the Edmonton Oilers. And boy, Jesse decided to go on a little hiking trip in Elk Island National Park. And then he took this selfie with a bison. And does that look like a safe distance from a bison? Wow. So totally, it blew up on Instagram. And it is an example of what we should not be doing. So I'll go back to that story in a minute. Pussy can't score, darn it. There's another critique of Jesse, but that's okay. He's got a great smile. Okay, so why I put this up here is that the research also seems to support the idea that our outcomes and intentions are improved when messaging relates very clearly to a charismatic megafauna. So if we choose a larger charismatic species in our park where we are trying to do some big behavior change in visitors, and the research seems to say that, you know, that try to find a species that people can really relate to or really identify easily, which is sort of a no-brainer. Right? Long story short, how do we capitalize on this misstep by Jesse Puljujärvi? Elk Island did a great pivot. They used this opportunity as a communication opportunity. They teamed up with Jesse to he branded himself as the Bison King, and they talked about how this is not a safe distance from animals, and they did a big social media campaign around it. We were involved with a technique of measuring how far away you should be from bison or moose with the park. During COVID, we were trying to find new ways of communicating to visitors, and we created a video with the park interpreters related to that, and then pushed that out to visitors because there was such social distancing requirements at the time. But the big win here was that Jesse's fame and this Bison King was enabled the friends of the park to leverage an opportunity to be part of the Oilers 50-50 draw. Which, if you've ever seen news stories about Oilers 50-50 draws in Alberta, you'll see that we're crazy gamblers in Alberta, and the pots are usually over, close to $1 million. So it was a fantastic opportunity for them to raise money for the NGO associated with the park too. So turning lemonade from lemons, I guess. Okay, next picture. All right, this gets to another idea that is actually percolating quite nicely in the literature now. And I mentioned attitudes and information, knowledge gain, but one of the things we really want to highlight the importance of changing or affecting during interpretation is this idea of emotions. So, hope, guilt, pride, anger, we all feel these things sometimes when we're listening to environmental communications or we're reading an environmental story about what we're doing to the planet. Emotions arising from park interpretation programs can be negative. So we can create things, we can feel really badly about threats to birds or bat populations. Or when we talk about, we can feel hope and pride when we talk about what people are doing to make a difference. So we can have those conversations with visitors, or we can talk about them on our signage. Researchers, this is more of a psychological processing thing, but when we feel an emotion, it actually helps us process and bank that information in our memories more effectively. So emotion, in essence, helps visitors retain information that they've learned at the parks through that emotional experience. But there is a bit of a mixed bag, and so that's why I have happy faces and frowny faces there. there's a really mixed bag right now of what is a more important emotion to elicit. So, you know, is it pride and hope that we should be emphasizing, or is it okay to let visitors feel guilt and feel fear and feel anxiety? In fact, it might be more productive in some ways, as long as if they're feeling those negative emotions, that they're at the end of that session, there's also an opportunity to feel like, oh, but this is the way forward. This is positive actions I can take, or this is a you know, that opportunity to feel that arc of emotions and move forward with information on how to make a difference. So it's still a bunch of it. There's a lot of work going on in this area around the role of emotions and how you pair that with outcomes that you're seeking. And the next slide, I actually do a little bit of a summary here. I won't go into it too much, but basically we understand that, oh yeah, I didn't talk about guilt. Guilt can result from a feeling of obligation. So we're tapping into people's sense of moral responsibility too. So that's personal morals. We can tap into that as well if we wish. But it's really important to turn that the guilt, the dread, the anxiety into something good that we can use moving forward. So I'll just go on to the next slide, please. All right, so going back to Yessi again, he's back on the screen here. Long story short, it is hard. It's hard to affect behavior change, to affect attitudinal change. And so these are some of the things we focus on as behavioral researchers. What we wanted to go and understand this a bit more in the Alberta context. You can see we've got things like people's values, their norms, their personal norms, and also the social norms that they share with everybody else that they're visiting at the time. Their sense of efficacy. So how much power do they have, or control or knowledge do they have to make a change? We're interested in studying all these things simultaneously when we go out and do research. I think I'm going to be done soon, right? I'm going to time-wise. So I just wanted to highlight one study we worked on here, which was looking at those variables, but then looking at emotions. You can see one method, so the next slide, of actually trying to measure emotions. Sorry, we collect, sorry, this is going back to this thing. So we studied this from 2008 and 2018, 2019. We did respondents, collected responses, and then revisited them 12 months later to see what they were doing at different parks. So these are people who had attended interpretive programs in Alberta parks. There was 11 parks at the time that were delivering interpretive programs. So next slide. And you can see how we're measuring emotion in particular, because I wanted to drill down on this as a theme right now, really quickly here. But you can see that in this sample only, so this isn't the broad kind of systematic reviews I've been talking about, but just our study in particular in Alberta, you can see that being inspired, feeling proud, were really important kind of outcomes arising from those interpretive programs. They didn't leave feeling as guilty, although that was part of the element they were feeling as well. But we wanted to plug this in, can I have the next slide? And just look at how emotion, which I've circled in orange here, related to these other variables. And I will not dwell on the other variables today. Basically what this model is trying to indicate is at the very far right of the model, we have environmental intentions. So what are they going to do going forward after attending an environmental interpretation presentation at Alberta Parks? What are they going to do going forward? And we can see that attitude change is important. That was going to be a major influence. We can see that things like cognitive attitude change were different, but emotions plays a really important role too. All of these things kind of played a nearly equal role, though emotions was less meaningful. So that's the takeaway. What I want to say here is guilt had far fewer statistically associations, which means, in layperson's language, that guilt wasn't as effective as, say, pride and inspiration in affecting change in these people as they left the programs, and 12 months later, which was an interesting thing. So the thing to take away from this particular complex model is that, we want to remind visitors that bears and squirrels have value, and it's our responsibility to protect them and protect their home. But if you're feeling guilty about forgetting your reusable water bottle or a cloth shopping bag on your visit, parks need to tap into that. You can tap into that guilt, and then you can convert it by talking about more holistic emphasis on emotions, and also combining it with things like their values, their attitudes. Personal interpretation is so much more than just visitor satisfaction or park programming. It's about increasing that connection to nature, understanding the influence we have on the environment, and ultimately our interconnectivity. Okay, I'm just going to move that forward to the next slide. So I've stopped dwelling on emotions for now, and I just want to switch to something fairly different, just for fun. And it's talking about AR and VR. So augmented reality and virtual reality. And some of you in the room will say, oh, we can't afford to do that. We can't do that as a park agency. How are we going to afford? It's becoming more affordable, I promise you. And what is cool about this technology is that you can gauge audiences outside of the park, which is great. So it's a double investment. If you have it in the park, great. But what they're really finding, and from an environmental communications perspective, is that we're able to reach audiences, non-traditional audiences as well, including people in the classroom, obviously. But what is cool about this, and I wanted to highlight these two studies. One was a study by Hoffman in Australia, and she was using it to expose children to experiences in Queensland's Barrier Reef. And what she found is the immersive reality of being in a VR context was actually produced just as good outcomes as what they would have in the park. So if they couldn't afford to get those kids to the park, they actually were doing some good in terms of communicating what it's like to be in the Barrier Reef. And so that's interesting, that there's these dual kind of opportunities. What I think is more meaningful is this study here on the right, which is the Project Shell. And if you Google it, I'm not going to show you any videos, but projectshell.org. Basically, what they designed the project to be is you take on the persona of a loggerhead turtle who's trying to lay their eggs on a beach, or trying to swim past fishing nets, or trying to do all their ordinary life experiences. And what they found is that it profoundly influenced the viewers of these programs. So you become the turtle in this experience, and it enables the viewers to become much more empathetic to what the experience that this wildlife is having to go through. And bringing people to tears, really, when there's some very moving images in it. So I can't explain it or describe it well, but if you click on that project, you can see what they're doing. And what is very interesting, the thing I wanted to take away from today with this particular project example is that the importance of individualized connection with wildlife. So rather than the species at large, loggerhead turtles, this kind of technology and other techniques in environmental communication allows us to focus in on an individual, one turtle in that big species. And that seems to have an incredibly important payback from a communication standpoint, because people can then resonate or connect further or more deeply with that individual and that individual animal's struggles to survive. Okay, so that is an important takeaway facilitated by this. That, and next slide here, can also be done in the park, in that we can interact so closely with individual animals in the park that we connect with. So here's a study that we were working on, and Jill Butterfield, who's a postdoc working with me during the COVID era, so 2 years ago, we were working in Alberta parks, and we were doing a cross comparison of two different techniques in interpretation. One was building bee boxes for a science, citizen science project. So the park visitors would come in, build the bee box, learn about bees from the interpreter, and go home and try to apply those best practices for wild bees. At the same park, we had a different program where visitors would come in and they get to learn from the interpreter in the field about bees, and then get to pet bees. So that's what she's doing right now. She's going to pet the bee. And then we basically measured outcomes by follow-up interviews with these folks and said, what are you doing now 6 months later? And how did this experience move you? And all those sorts of things. And we found, interestingly, that the petting of bees, that interaction was just like mind-blowing. So that interaction is important, that connection. And again, that's kind of what we're getting back with the logger turtle. Even though they're virtually experiencing what it's like to be a logger turtle, it's that connection. So embodiment, empathy, connection. I want to take that. So the last things I would just highlight, I would just say pledges are a new thing that we're talking a lot about in the visitor experience realm, where we have a visitor arriving at a destination, and you've all heard of the Palau Pledge. We're starting to apply that in parks and other tourist destinations. I know that pt1 National Park is experimenting with this, although they've had some pretty significant troubles in the last 2 weeks, so I'm not sure what's going to go on going forward from a visitor management standpoint. But importantly, visitor pledges, especially when they're done in front of people's fellow peers or fellow visitors, that social aspect. I'm pledging to do this, and all these witnesses around you also are pledging it, or are listening to your pledge, I should say. That seems to elevate the efficacy of these pledges. I did promise I would talk about post-visit resources, and that's the next slide. I just want to highlight those. I mentioned Jill Biddlefield earlier. There's been a number of researchers in the environmental communications field that have been examining the effectiveness of investing resources, funding sort of these follow-up communication strategies with visitors once they leave the park. And we know that this is incredibly effective when you're twinning it with a moving park experience first, and then you're following up with deeper conversations with the visitors through social media, through maybe newsletters, through discussion groups. And so let me just see here. Advances in technology have really facilitating this and making this more affordable for park agencies. Podcasts, YouTube videos, and other tools are all used to continue the conversation and keep people invested. It's also a good way to connect people to other conservation-minded individuals. So it's just to facilitate, connect them, use these resources to connect them with other, with ENGO groups or community groups that are focused on conservation. So these systematic reviews or these comprehensive reviews of literature that have studied these kinds of techniques are demonstrating that these are quite effective, a good way to invest your scarce dollars. And finally, the last two I'm going to talk about, the next slide, is just social media. You all know how this could be used. I would only say, I'm not going to dwell on social media today because we've been there, done that. I would just say the important thing to emphasize would be to match the social media platform that you're using with the target market that you want to talk to. So incredibly important from a generational standpoint or a digital user standpoint. So, TikTok, that's going to talk to the students I'm teaching these days. Facebook has been demonstrated in some of these research projects to be really good at communicating to the Gen Xers in the crowd and carrying on that conversation, for example, through after visit resourcing. Right, next slide. I've lost my sense of time here. I want to just highlight one or two more things. So this is outside of the literature and just a personal opinion, I would say. So this is reflecting on our experiences of, here is Edith Cavell, which is Angel Glacier. It's a popular destination in Jasper I mentioned earlier. And it's a beautiful site with lots of visitors. Great opportunity to do some very innovative, interesting environmental communication. But one of my bugaboos is that we have no environmental communications there, nor do we have really, and I'll get to the Columbia ice fields in a minute, which is also my backyard. What we could be doing is when visitors are walking around this setting, and I'll go to the next slide, we could be talking about more than just hazard mitigation. So there's two signs up on the Cavell Meadows right now. One is about warning, look for tidal waves coming off this pool of water at the base of the glacier, which did fall. A chunk of ice did fall a number of years ago now and wiped out all the visitor infrastructure at that site. Fortunately, the piece of the glacier fell at 4 a.m. in the morning. And so, instead of just talking about hazard mitigation, maybe we could talk about why part of the glacier fell off. And then we're tapping into also the anxiety, maybe the guilt, maybe the these internal emotions that people are feeling when they read about and learn about climate change and the anthropogenic kind of connections to it. So we could have longer conversations at that site with our visitors through passive signage, or more interestingly, point duty. So when people are walking up to you and talking, an interpreter comes and talks to you at an exhibit sort of thing, or a standing exhibit for a while. The last picture I have here on the far right, and I apologize for the quality of the picture, is what Parks Canada has posted currently at the pavilions at the Icefields, Columbia Icefields, the big interpretive center they have there. So the whole bottom of the basement is devoted to discussions about climate change and what their visitors are seeing at that site. Sadly, we have only 3 suggestions on what visitors can do to make a change going forward. If they see this retreating glacier, we have a display that's suggesting that riding bikes and reading books is going to solve the planet's problems. So I would encourage you, if you have any influence in content on interpretation, is to rethink the kinds of behaviors that you're advocating for, and not be too reticent to tackle the tough issues like climate change, and actually look for more meaningful behavioral suggestions, perhaps, going forward. So that's my personal slag for the day. So I think I'm out of time. Let me look at my time. Thank you. I'm just going to wrap it up there. The last thing I would say, just one person's research that I would really love to highlight before I close, is Seth Wines, coming out of Concordia University. He's not, it doesn't have anything to do with parks or interpretation, but he is doing really interesting research about what behaviors make a change when it comes to things like climate change. And his research really focuses down on how individual behaviors, like putting solar panels on our roofs, well, that's nice, but it's things like advocacy and voting that are actually shifting the landscape when it comes to progressive environmental policy. So also think about how you can weave that into your resourcing considerations and your planning and design. So I'm going to leave it there and leave this summary slide up. The slide up is called Summary Key Elements for Effective Communications. And leave it there. Thank you.
We do have time for one question for those in the audience. We do have a microphone over here, so that should broadcast to people. If you're online, actually, Karen is monitoring the chat, so we also have some opportunities there.
Sorry, I lost my watch, so I went over time. I normally don't do that.
That's okay, you're on time.
I hate that. Yeah, go ahead, Richard.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. I learned a heck of a lot in that presentation. I just, as someone completely ignorant of the literature myself, in terms of, I guess I'm really curious about the effectiveness of signage and also that visitor pledge, which is not something I've heard of before. So I just wondering, in general, how strong or how kind of mature is the scientific, kind of the body of studies to speak to the effectiveness of those?
You were listening really well. So the body of science is still building. Mm-hmm. We've got 25 years of research under our belt so far, but that area of research isn't as heavily funded, so there's not as many studies as you would find in other fields of study in conservation. I think we have a lot of work to do. Long story short, to ask your question, we often get this question from park agencies: what is the most effective tool that we should be investing in? And of course, the most effective tool is usually somewhat expensive because it's usually related to people. Like it's the personal interpretation, that individual, the back and forth, that seems to be the most effective tool based on the literature that we have thus far. So the studies, the empirical studies that we've systematically studied things, that is really a very useful tool. But sometimes it depends on the kind of behavior you're trying to target. So if it's, if it's Gen Zs and how they're very, and on what they're doing, in a particular park context that's really strange, maybe then it's a TikTok video that you need to be manufacturing that would be really quick and could be repeated on different platforms. But so figure out who your market is, your target segment, I should say, what the behavior is you want to change, and that might determine what the best tool going forward is. But generally speaking, it's people talking to one another, and it's that interpreter, or maybe even the CO, the conservation officer, or the ranger coming by and having a few key tips with the right phrasing. That personal contact can make all the difference. So that's a form of environmental communications too. Even if they're not trained interpreters, they are given a small toolbox to work with that can support environmental behavior in the park as they're doing their rounds, for example.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Okay, thank you. Move away.
I'm just coming back up. I'm going to invite our next speaker, Trevor, to come on up. I'm just going to check the technology here. Trevor, as you'll see, has a wealth of experience actually with regard to sort of various portfolios, especially federally, and knows quite a lot about a lot of things from my experience just talking to him as well. So I'm really pleased to have him here this morning. Again, I apologize for our glitch there, but none of us are touching anything with the, the slides cut out. So my apologies to Elizabeth too as well. Actually, Trevor, we should be fine on that side of it. And I will turn the sort of forum over to him. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'll start out by saying thank you for inviting me and echoing the land acknowledgement that we had to start the day, just as a point. It's also, for me at least, and I hope anyway for everybody else, it's just so damn nice to see people. And for all of those of you who are online, too bad. But it is nice to have at least a few people here. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we balance pragmatism and so on. But before I do, I'm going to start with a quick statement of positionality. You know, and one of the things that is utterly fantastic among the long list of things that's fantastic about being a grandfather, and I know most of you in the room at least were looking at me going, well, it couldn't possibly be you. But my age is deceiving. I'm actually almost 60. But not about a year ago, my granddaughter, who's almost 2 now, and I were out, and she was very proud of herself because she was able to walk and was just kind of getting going. And it was a particularly crisp December day. We'd had a fresh snowfall, and I live at the end of a cul-de-sac. And one of the things I like about it is that with the way the plow goes, when it goes around, it more or less skips my driveway and dumps all the snow in my neighbor's. And so I typically have a very, very small little skiff of snow at the end of my driveway. Why am I telling you that? So I was out walking around with my little baby at the time, who probably was just over, she's probably about 12 and a half months. And as I say, she was quite proud of herself for walking along, and we came walking up my driveway, and I just kind of stepped in the first couple steps off the road, and I turned, and she wasn't following me. And I kind of looked down at her, and I was thinking to myself, Sophie, what are you doing? And she'd been very proudly walking along, and then she'd stopped at the end of my driveway, and she was staring intently at the ground, and I couldn't figure out what she was looking at. And I realized that even though the plow had left almost no snow in my driveway, there was actually a ridge there that was about a half an inch to an inch high. And I walked right over it, I didn't even notice it was there. She was standing there, and you could tell she was calculating, how the hell am I going to get over that? And she was really thinking, this is a big problem. And she made this big exaggerated step to get over it, and was very proud of herself for making it. I didn't even notice it. And it was a real reminder for me how much perspective matters, right? If you're a little wee tiny kid, an inch of snow is a big deal. If you're a big fat old guy like me, don't even notice. And so I think that it's always important to kind of think of where we come from. And so I talk to all of my students about always asking, as you're listening to people, well, where's this person coming from? So I just thought I would do that so that you can kind of get a sense of where I am from this. I identify as a straight white male Anglophone from Ontario, and in particular from Ottawa. I was actually born and raised in Ottawa. Most people in Ottawa are from somewhere else. I grew up hating Toronto, and I've managed to keep that intact. I'm enjoying watching them not be in first place today in that blue team that plays down the road. The most important roles in my life are as father, grandfather, and brother. That's what grounds me. I'm trained in environmental studies. I'm actually a member of a program now that I graduated from way back in 1985. And I've trained in environmental studies and resource management. I spent 16 years in Environment Canada, mostly in the Canadian Wildlife Service. I worked in Ontario, Prairie, Pacific, and Ontario regions. Atlantic, sorry, I missed that. I was an advisor at the Forest Products Association of Canada for a year, which if you had sort of charted my trail from when I graduated from University of Waterloo, I had hair. I had long hair. I had 2 earrings. I had a beard. I smoked a pipe. I protested. The M&R people might appreciate the fact that I protested the spring bear hunt vociferously, and I decided that a good way to do that would be to throw fake blood on a bunch of people. But that didn't work out too well, because when we were getting ready to do it, we tripped on the rug at this place we're at, and we dumped it all on the floor at a place a lot like this, just as a digression. And then I ended up with DFO for 11 years, most of which was in fisheries management science. I ended up there as the senior ADM for science, and then I was the senior vice president for operations for Parks Canada. So all of national parks, national historic sites, and so on in the agency at Parks reported to me. So the latter half of my career was very much in senior management. You'll see that reflected in the comments which follow. I was very much in the leadership roles in the national program context, but to go back to Liz's point, I started my career very much as a nuts and bolts protected area manager, responsible for national wildlife areas in the Canadian Wildlife Service context and all of that sort of stuff. To my surprise, and one thing to highlight in there, I ended up briefly in law enforcement, which again, when I think of my protester background and so on, I would never pick that track. But you learn an awful lot about the law by participating in programs that enforce it. And so I got a lot out of that. Really, I was a key connector in many respects between the professional public service and elected officials and their staff. So I spent a lot of time working at that sort of messy middle, if you will, in a lot of ways. And that reflects my experience. So today, I'm what's called a practitioner in residence at the University of Waterloo. I've been there since January 2020. I've continued my lifelong pattern of absolutely excellent timing. I arrived at the University of Waterloo 6 weeks before the place shut down. I remember very clearly I used to lecture at night, and I was walking back from class on a Monday night in February, thinking to myself, I'm starting to get this prof gig. Like I was walking along through the park in Waterloo. It was a particularly cold night, but I was feeling warm inside. I was like, I'm kind of getting it. And we closed the next week. So can't have everything. Practitioner in residence, though, is a polite term for prof with no PhD. And so I now draw on my experience. And one of the things that continues to surprise many of my students is that I know nothing, for the most part, about the literature and don't really care. So it reflects heavily in although I'm actually reading more and more. One of my goals in life is to be Derek Armitage, who's a prof at CSIRS. And so I'm trying to catch up to him on reading. The final point I'll make in terms of background is just that the reason I picked that picture is threefold. One is pure vanity. I just wanted people to know what I looked like when I had hair on my head, and most of it was not gray. 2 is to emphasize I spent a lot of time in Parliament. That's a picture from the Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans, where I used to testify quite regularly. I've been before parliamentarians well over 100 times. I know what they're like. I spent a lot of time there. And the third is more, frankly, just for myself. It's kind of fun. The colleague who's sitting beside me in the picture, looking just, when are you going to stop talking? Is Jody Thomas, who was ended up as the Deputy Minister of National Defense and is now the Prime Minister's National Security Advisor. And she would be very depressed to look at that picture because she didn't look like that anymore. Anyway, okay, so on my thing, it's not moving now. So my roadmap for today, now we're all going to have technology problems. My computer is frozen up on me, is to have a quick focus on scope and terminology. And I'll outline my take on what I think protected areas can and should do. I'll talk a little bit about some of the struggles that I think protected area managers face on a regular basis, including trying to get computers that don't work to work. And then I'll suggest a few needed reforms to our protected area programs. And then I'll just sort of see if this will work again. Oh, perfect. Now I'm here. Okay, and so then I'll end up with a couple of comments on conservation and commenting on the role of protected areas in a broader conservation context. So my focus is generally in my role at Waterloo and in my career is more on biodiversity conservation as opposed to just protected areas. I view protected areas as spaces in which physical features and biodiversity are protected for the foreseeable future. You'll notice park is not in there, or national wildlife area or whatever. That is my kind of definition of it. For me, protected area mechanisms include private conservation. That's where I started my career, working in Ontario on a lot of this kind of stuff. Marine and terrestrial, national wildlife areas, national parks, national marine conservation areas, and all of their indigenous, provincial, territorial, municipal analogs. That whole basket for me is what I think of as protected areas. And I find the IUCN categorization of protected areas very unhelpful and quite divisive. I find the debate about what level you're at and is it truly protected and so on. One of the things I learned a long time ago in negotiating, which is a big part of what I used to do, is when people would say things that I just absolutely didn't agree with, but just was not interested in debating, I just would not reply. And that was always very problematic, usually for the person on the other side. And often they'd say, "Did you not hear me?" And I said, "Yeah." But I just stopped. And so the debate on what level things are, that's kind of how I deal with it. I just sort of don't get into it. I think we should be collectively focused on the broader biodiversity agenda. But given the focus of this conference here today in this gathering, I am, of course, going to focus on protected areas. Geographically, my scope or focus is south of 60 degrees. There are a number of things I'm going to say in the subsequent slides that if you were focused on our arrangements in the 3 territories of Canada or in some parts of marine, you might think, just a minute, that's not correct. I know that. Okay, so there are a number of things that because the conservation context and legal context is so different in the north, I'm going to just sort of pretend it doesn't exist for the purpose of this thing. And then I also will use a bunch of language that's a little bit wussy because I've learned if you make declarative statements, there are a few places down the line in the talk where I say there are no laws that say this. Immediately someone's hand pops up. Well, have you looked at the Act in Upper Slobovia? And so I've allowed myself a few sort of get out of jail free card type things so that I don't have some of the declarative knowledge or language that's in there. So what should parks and protected areas and so on generally do? I think we'd all agree that protecting biodiversity is job one in a protected area. And at minimum, this involves maintaining the status quo, which I think involves ensuring no loss. I debated whether to put no net loss in here or not, but I thought that might be tipping it down the line. No loss or decline of species or landscape features. Many, I think, would also argue that enhancements, whether they're naturally driven or human induced, like rewilding, reintroduction, that kind of stuff, are essential in protected areas. Of course, we can always have too much of a good thing. Anybody who's involved in managing, for example, parks in Atlantic Canada right now would quite happily, I think, welcome any kind of mechanism for sterilizing every moose in the province because we got moose. I just wonder why it isn't meese. But anyway, we've got moose coming out of our ears down there. So you can't have too much of a good thing. And certainly geese, Canada geese, which to me, I kind of got to one point in my career, I just thought of them as rats with wings. And they've got really good PR though. I mean, everybody loves them. But you can't have too many of them. To me, defining terms such as ecological integrity or ecosystem approach is food for an awful lot of debate. And as I have started to dip my toe and my nose into the literature, I've discovered it's a pretty wealthy debate. Some of it is interesting. Pragmatically, I think managers just want to make sure that things don't get worse. And ideally that they get better. And in my experience, at least, both as a protected area manager and in helping guide programs, pretty well every protected area manager can tell you what she thinks is okay or better. Can she always say, and here categorically is why? Not always, but she can pretty much always say, I think we're doing better, or whoops, we're on a slide. So I think fundamentally that's what they end up being about. I think most of us, like this tree hugger here, would have the idea that parks and protected areas generally have a special species protection role. Obviously, they protect entire ecosystems, but listed species typically need additional protection. That's the whole idea. And PAs can certainly be in vital importance to them as refugia and other sorts of ways of recovery and so on. And I think that most people anyway would argue that that's a key function of PAs. I know when we were writing the Species at Risk Act, which I think most conservationists will agree hits the asymptote of perfection in terms of legislative initiative. Usually people laugh at that, but for some people who don't know what asymptote is, kind of, you shouldn't swear like that. But in any event, when we were drafting the Species at Risk Act, I was heavily involved in the literally fingers to keyboard around a lot of that stuff way back then. We thought what was going to happen is that once species XYZ got listed, whether federal or provincial or territorial, almost immediately what would happen is that critical habitat would get identified, and that would spark all these little micro protected areas of some kind, or conservation areas very focused on them and so on. And yeah, it hasn't really quite worked. But anyway, I think most people would figure that's a key function of protected areas. We just saw a perfect example in the last speaker, and what Liz's comments were about the importance of connecting Canadians, connecting people, I should say, generally to nature. It's pretty hard to debate that, I think. I think most people would just agree that nature's just good for us. And I was reminded of that this morning because like a good little bureaucrat that I have been for a long time, I showed up this morning right on time. Stood there all alone in the lobby for a little while. And so I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll go and stand up by that little stream in the back that OM&R built or whoever it was and so on. It just made me feel good. It's a trivial little thing. But I think being with nature, generally speaking, makes us all feel good. It's good for us. And I think it'd be pretty hard to argue with that. Most people, I think, as well, take comfort from knowing it's out there. Even I personally can't go to blah, 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 blah. Knowing that it's there and it's protected for the future, I think makes, again, most people pretty good. And so connecting to nature is really important. And as Liz has pointed out just now, it also has this massive knock-on effect. And I think her talk just scratches the surface of the benefits of protected areas for conservation writ large and so on. And I don't think that's unique to Canada at all. I think that my experience, certainly living in other parts of the world, that's very, very ubiquitous, and so on. I think we would probably all agree that protected areas should feature fully transparent ecosystem monitoring. I think everybody would say, well, that's a very good idea. Monitoring is needed to detect ecosystem change, and I think to inform management priorities. I know often when I was sitting here trying to balance, for example, the challenges of how big or small ski hill operations in Lake Louise and in Jasper and in Banff, which is a big part of the Parks Canada operation. One of the things that I think is important is to say, well, what's the environment around them doing or not, depending on the way you look at it, because it gives you a context for making decisions, right? I think it's vital to evaluating performance of your management regime and so on. You put in place the following measures, are they working or not? And so again, I think monitoring is quite important, and comprehensive tracking of and integration of multiple parameters, I think supports stronger decisions. I think that if we get inadequate monitoring, on the flip side of that, it really substantially increases our risks. I was never very comfortable. I'm by nature a bit of a risk taker in management type things, so often got me into trouble. But I was never very comfortable at all with the sort of well, let's just roll the dice, and if we build this trail here, we'll just sort of see what happens. Probably it's going to be good. No, I just really don't like that. And I think that the more information you have around things, the better, because data sharing as well builds trust. People like to joke, of course, that I'm from Ottawa and I'm here to help you, all that kind of stuff and so on. And I mean, it's a nice little line. But actually, I found over the years that most people that I would interact with in a whole variety of roles, some of which I was sort of describing earlier, generally speaking, without being personal about it, most of the time, usually to get people to not like me, they have to at least meet me once. Sometimes it doesn't take a full meeting to sort of, oh, who is that guy? But usually they have to at least meet me. So every now and then, though, I'd show up and people would just start beating on me, right, you're from Ottawa, you're a bureaucrat, blah, blah, and away they go. But generally speaking, I found that if you sort of said to people, I'm on your side too. I'm just as much as the conservation as everybody else and so on. Oftentimes I could read people's faces, even from afar. They don't trust people who they think, anyway, are withholding information and not sharing stuff generally, right? Data sharing, I think, builds trust. Data hoarding builds distrust. And I think that if you're going to have trust in the management regime and so on for a protected area system, the data sharing part of it, I think, is really quite critical. Some of us would agree as well that protected areas should be ecological research hubs or living laboratories. For anyone in the room, anybody recognize who this is? This is Rachel Carson. And so one of the things when she wrote Silent Spring, one of the things that I think is, to me at least, rather interesting is that many of the examples she used, quote, in real life to draw from in terms of understanding the impact of DDT on birds in particular, bird eggs and a variety of other things, were from protected areas. She had a stream of information, not only from there, but that was one of them. And I often thought that, you know, that really is quite important. In my view, at least, protected areas offer one of the few control sites that we have out on the landscape against which to compare ecosystem change. Often they host, this is one of my wussy terminology things. I say often they host, probably is almost never. But anyway, they could host considerable research infrastructure. One of the things that used to just amaze me is if I think of the spaces that I visited in Parks Canada, the ability to host researchers in incredible facilities is massive. You know, and so there is that opportunity to use these as research platforms and so on. And ecosystem level experiments under controlled conditions are really possible in a protected area. Probably some of the most fun I've ever had in terms of program management was to set a big chunk of the prairie on fire. If any of you have ever been out in grassland areas where there are no trees and you get grass on this thing, to walk along with a drip torch and just deliberately set stuff on fire, it's just fun. You're supposed to be serious, you know, we're obeying all the protocols, you put on these big long gloves and so on, but watching the prairie go whoosh, it's cool. And, you know, particularly if you have judged the wind correctly. If you haven't, less cool. But the thing is that you can run little experiments if you're trying to figure out how native grass species composition works, and in particular what the role of fire in an ecosystem is. You can't do it without setting at least a bit of it on fire and see what happens. You can do that in protected areas under controlled conditions and so on. And I think research like that can help inform protected area decision making for sure. But they're also particularly well suited for comparative analysis of landscape treatments in protected and unprotected contexts. My daughter's about to start a master's degree out west at the University of Alberta, actually. You know, one of the things they're going to be doing is comparing what happens with certain bird communities in alpine and subalpine circumstances inside and outside of Alberta. You can look at that literally right next door to each other in terms of your observation sites, right? You really can't do that too many other places. So I think that this notion that they could be, and notice here I say some of us might also agree, because I know, we'll come back to this in a sec, a lot of people just don't agree with it. But nonetheless, I think that's something that they could do. Some of us might also agree that protected areas should be change leaders and innovation test beds. So I picked this picture as a suburban park kind of thing. It's you know, you can have little miniature protected area type things in and around the city to demonstrate to people how things work. If you think of Tommy Thompson Park just over in Toronto, the little, I find it always a hilarious sort of thing to think about. People think of it as this great natural area where, of course, in fact, it was created by dumping all of the stuff they took out of the subway excavation, had to put it somewhere and dumped it in the lake. And so now it's this beautiful natural wildlife area. Well, not so much. But the thing is that you can demonstrate to people by actually physically going there and saying, well, look, we actually have swans, for example, in Ontario, a whole variety of species. They're right there. And if you manage water in a certain way, look what happens. It's good stuff, kind of thing. And people can see it, as opposed to looking at it on your VR experience. Fantastic, but you know, some people it's sort of hard to get to. So anyway, I think governments could use protected areas to pilot alternate energy systems. Why is it, for example, if we're going to push everybody in Canada to really think hard about generating different ways or look at different ways for generating energy, you know, we could be using low-head hydrogen pilot projects, for example, in protected areas all over the place. Electric vehicles, charging stations, on and on and on it goes, right, to demonstrate new management techniques and to serve as tangible evidence that things work. One of the things that used to really amaze me is, in a lot of the international things that I used to go to on behalf of Canada, which is easily one of the nicest things to do as a federal bureaucrat, people would often say, you know, these things you're doing really well. You know, our advocacy on climate change is working. How's that working out in more protected areas? And you used to have to go, check please. Because, you know, the ability to sort of walk that back into we're demonstrating all this ourselves and so on sometimes is a bit challenging, but could be there. And Liz showed us a perfect example an example of how you can communicate on, for lack of a better term, non-park or non-protected area things in the park. In my experience, at least, if you look at climate change, many people, certainly I'm one, have a hard time picturing that in the context of the globe and looking at the whole world, taking a truly global position. But if you stand there in downtown Banff and you look down the road, you can see where the change on the side of the mountain is in terms of vegetation and structure and so on. And you can say to people, that's happening because of climate change. People can wrap their heads around that space and understand it and say, you know, actually there are different plant species, the avifauna is behaving differently and so on and so on. So you can kind of get that. And I think PAs allow us a huge chance to do that. And I think they can give us a meaningful and comprehensible scale for dialogue on these broader sustainability issues. You know, talking to people about waste management, for example. How do you control the inputs and outputs? How do you actually leave them trace while you're still out there on the landscape, as Liz was talking to us about, and so on. So there's a lot in there that I think is fairly obvious. And I also think that most people, or most of us anyway, would likely agree that governance system protected areas should embrace, I chose the word embrace fairly carefully, that I mean willingly, positively, constructively, as opposed to, we'll tolerate it, right? Indigenous rights and engage local communities. In many respects, this is just a matter of law. It's not a choice. Well, you know, you decided to obey the law today. Tomorrow I might not. That's just dumb. So in many cases, it's a legal question. But sustaining arguments, if you sort of thought of it as a debating society technique and someone said, defend the argument that you should not be working with Indigenous, I don't know how you do that. Like, I just don't know how you do that. And I think rationalizing non-engagement of local communities is pretty difficult as well. You know, I've worked out that the best way to run this park is to talk to almost nobody, you know, and just decide and so on ourselves. And when I say that, I'm quite aware that it sounds silly. But, you know, historically, there's a bit of a tendency sometimes to do that. And I think that one could probably argue that innovative governance arrangements around protected areas could be seen as a bit of a test bed. Let's try this, this, and this. You know, one of the things that I think the federal government is really good at is saying, here's an enormously difficult problem. Let's add 5 things to it and see how that works. And so often, if you sort of say, oof, we're probably not going to solve the entire set of relationships between Indigenous people, non-Indigenous people, community folks, and so on in the entire country at once. How about if we just try it here? To me, is often not a bad kind of thing, and say, let's kind of give this a go around a protected area. I think is an opportunity for that. So if you sort of think of those things, what would that leave us as sort of a protected area mission that includes what? Protecting landscape features and biodiversity, devoting special attention to listed species, connecting people to nature, monitoring programs that establish scientific foundations for evidence-based decisions. Liz and I and Chris Lemieux and others have written about. There's research hubs that contribute to broader biodiversity research as opposed to just the site and so on, and really modern and inclusive governance arrangements. Might be, I think, a 6-point sort of mission-y, vision-y type thing, if that sort of works for you. Have any of you been, well, any of you who have ever been to Gross Moor National Park will recognize one of the most beautiful places on earth. Standing there looking back down that fjord, man, it's magic. And if you ever are lucky enough to fly up it in a helicopter, just do it. You know, don't kill anyone to do it. But other than that, come right up to that. You know, it's that depends who it was. No, not really. Okay, so it's always dangerous to typecast, right? That's always a bad thing to do. So, but I'm going to do it just a little bit now anyway. I think most people who don't work in a protected area or directly in a protected area program would say, "Oh, that's a pretty darn good vision there, Trevor. Well done." Yeah. Okay. So I'll just read the room and say, "Yep, that's exactly what you're thinking," and that it's kind of achievable, right? And I think many advocacy groups, certainly the ones I worked with an awful lot, would say, "Yeah, that's or some variant around that is pretty good," and you should be able to do that. Like now would be good. I think most people who work in a protected area or a protected area program and so on would be kind of very much more in that. That's really nice in theory. Like it's a really well done. You know, nice mission there, practitioner in residence from the University of Waterloo, close to no protected areas, or they might just get up and walk out of the room. And so, you know, you just sit there and you say, nice theory, but. So what I want to do is turn a little bit to the but with one T. And so defining, so if you go look at that ecological protection thing, defining key terms is, there we go, really problematic at meaningful operational scales, right? So if you look at definition of ecological integrity, it used to just drive me right out of my mind in a couple of the jobs that I had, or ecosystem approach, or sustainable. Those are hard terms to just define just in principle. If you sort of sat there and said, abracadabra, you get to be queen for the day, and you just determine the definition of this and ground it in life, it's hard to figure that stuff out. Ecosystem approach is my personal favorite. Anybody who used to work with me would know if they were just kind of getting bored watching Trevor just sort of sit there and they wanted to fire him up a little bit, say, well, you know what, Trevor, I think we should do more on the ecosystem approach, because it would always just send me off the ceiling. Because what is it? How does it work? That kind of stuff. It's often really nightmarish to design those things at the scale, say, of a national wildlife area, a provincial park, a national park, or whatever, to sort of say in that scale context. That's really, really hard to do. And also, is it compatible with any other use? This is why I go back to, I find the utility of the distinctions really unhelpful. In a lot of mine, but the ones I was responsible for national wildlife areas in the prairies, for example, we had cattle on them regularly because we felt that was a useful disturbance mechanism for grass species. We used to, as I said, we used to set it on fire quite often. I had several oil wells on several of our parks, not active exploration, but just the dimping donkey type things. When I worked in DFO, I learned after a time that for reasons that I've never fully understood, people just kind of don't love fish. And so if you think of sort of campaigns around advocacy, look at all the NGOs, you very rarely see, except in BC where they're obsessed with salmon, you don't see too many save the blah, blah, blah fish, right? It's always pandas and monkeys and all that kind of other stuff and so on. And you see that the same thing in a lot of protected area systems. We don't allow killing of any animals, any wildlife at all, but we do allow fishing. It's an animal. Anyway, so the question about is use allowed and so on, this is right at the heart of a lot of the debate, for example, in efforts to try and put a new national park in the Okanagan Valley. Should you have grazing in there? Yes or no, yes or no. And it's one of those things, it's kind of binary. You can't say, yes, we're going to have grazing, but it's going to be every Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday afternoon. That doesn't work, right? And so there's a bit of that kind of thing. What about surrounding landscape conditions? Are you defining ecological integrity inside the boundaries of your space or in the whole ecosystem as a whole? And good luck if you're trying to figure that out in the marine context. And it doesn't matter whether you're looking at freshwater, if you're looking at, say, the efforts to create marine or aquatic protected areas. Why are you laughing so much? You're going to have this be in your thing? Oh, well, okay, so I'm prejudging or preempting the next talk. And so finding how you figure this out in the boundary and marine context, it's kind of like critical habitat under SARA. It makes no sense, right, in marine context. And so pragmatically, managers want to make sure things, as I said earlier, don't get worse and they get better. The many subjective and objective measures of what that means makes decision-making and achieving that first part of the mission really, really tough. On the species side, protecting listed species pragmatically is nowhere near as easy as it sounds. For a start, in an area of any significant size, often they have conflicting needs. I'm sure that if you took a completely anonymous poll of Parks Canada staff who work in the prairies and said, okay, if you knew for 100% sure that you wouldn't get caught, would you like to go and kill all the sage grouse in southern Alberta and Manitoba and Saskatchewan? They'd probably say, what time is the train leaving? Because if you're trying to manage space with the critical habitat designation that's in place for those animals, you can't build any physical structure because you don't want to provide perching habitat for predators and sage grouse and so on. So try building a fence. Good luck. It's really hard sometimes to manage. So you get these conflicting management things that happen, I think, fairly frequently. And the critical habitat designations, for any of you who have had to balance either critical habitat designations for multiple species or ones that really conflict with what you're trying to do, particularly for anyone managing a protected area whose water levels fluctuate regularly for a variety of species. Any of the Great Lakes protected areas examples are, for the most part, along the shore. I mean, usually you're managing water. It's a nightmare from a critical habitat point of view, right? And I think the other thing is that funding often gets tied to species X, Y, Z. And so I'm sorry you don't have any money to run your park, but if you'd like dollars to go and research the yada, yada, yada listed species, how much would you like? And when you just go, real challenge for protected area managers. And I think, as I said earlier, the notion that SARA would drive critical habitat just really hasn't panned out. I think some protected area managers would love to just ban all visitors. I think that if you could get away with it, they're messy, they're noisy, they're intrusive. We saw some examples of what they don't do, frankly. A lot of them don't just leave nothing behind, they leave lots behind. They're often harmful to nature. And building visitor infrastructure is expensive, it's boring. Try pitching to finance and to cabinet and to a minister, I want you to be the toilet king. Because it turns out that all our toilets, they really don't flush. And that's a real problem. To give you one of these useless facts, part of the reason we did a complete renovation of the infrastructure in one of our parks is we calculated that in order to deliver one liter of water out a shower head at a central camping ground, they had to pump into the system 29 liters of water. Because the infrastructure to get it from the source to the shower head was so antiquated and so full of leaks, you had to drive all this water through it. So fun facts fun is in the eye of the beholder, I guess, but fun facts like that sort of stick. But generally speaking, try and convince a minister and a cabinet we're going to really go in big on low flush toilets. Good luck with that. And visitors, the challenge, of course, is that for a protected area manager, in not all systems, but in many of them, they translate to revenue. I have more visitors, I can charge them more, I can extract more money from them as they come in, and many cases it goes directly into my budget. It's not too many protected area managers who can afford to just ignore that dynamic. And so how much connection is too much, I think, is a source of constant debate that you could have at great length. Ecosystem monitoring, to look at it, it's very rarely, another wussy word, I think it's never required, but it might be an exception. In some systems, we monitor a handful of indicator species, which if you wanted to sort of nerd out on biology and so on, you could have a lot of fun with that. Generally speaking, that concept, unless it's a whole pile, it's pretty problematic. But every now and then we monitor one or two. Broader ecosystem parameters monitoring is rare. It's almost non-existent. If you were to sort of go, let's look at water quality or water flows or hydrometric stuff or in most national parks, protected areas, so on across, you can't find that stuff. It's generally not done. I'm not aware of any protected area legislation in Canada that requires that. I'm not aware of anything that says something like the minister shall, not should, when she's feeling good, do the following sorts of things from a monitoring point of view. And at minimum, determining ecological integrity requires those deep time series data. So we have, in some cases, obligations to protect, conserve, maintain, whatever you want to call it, ecological integrity, with no requirement to collect the data and information that allow you to make that determination. Think about how well that's going to work out in real life, right? And so there are very few requirements in place. Again, I'm almost certain the answer is actually there are no requirements in place for protected area managers to share data collected in their parks. So again, if you wanted to go on and say, let's look at all of the bird collection data in all the parks in Ontario or in anywhere and so on, you'd have to be a fairly adept sleuth online to find that stuff. And not because not if you were looking at, say, evaluating park XYZ, if you just wanted to say, I'd kind of like to know what bird populations in the prairies are doing, have a look at the protected areas out there and see what that picture's, you can't find that stuff. And so sharing is not there. And I think that monitoring is generally seen by most protected area managers as a real pain in the neck. That's an add-on task for which I'm not funded, I'm not required, I'll get no credit for. And when I stack up all the list of things I have to do, it's not on it, so I'm not doing it. Is the sort of the pragmatic answer, it seems to me. Generating data and research for today's version of Rachel Carson, not my job. If I'm a protected area manager and so on, I think most of them are open to researchers coming in and saying, I got a problem here, if you can answer that, that'd be great. But very few protected area agencies historically have a deep research culture. Most protected areas programs in the country don't have a large science branch. For example, whose only function is research. Some of the agencies I worked in nationally and so on, you got a lot of well-trained, well-educated people. You didn't have a lot of people that were, quote, a researcher. For a long time, Parks Canada, for example, had one PhD, for example, who was an ornithologist based not in a park. And so, you've got, and PhDs, I'd be the first, because as I mentioned before, I'm a prof without a PhD. I think people who have PhDs are just fine. But so it's not the be all and end all. But if you think about researchers and so on, that kind of culture, typically not in a lot of parks. I'm unaware of any legislation or regulation that requires research to be undertaken in a park or a protected area of any kind. And I think that links between academia and protected areas are ad hoc at best. One of the things that has really stunned me since coming into the academic world, I don't know why I thought this, just stupid, I guess, but I thought that what would happen is that there'd be all of these links with the park system of Ontario or whatever, and there'd be back and forth, and students go, kind of like there's one of that at Queen's, right? And so on. Those links are, from my point of view, almost non-existent. And a thing that I'll apologize in advance to Dr. Murphy in the back, but I know I offended some of my colleagues at one point when I came to the university, and I said in a talk, most senior managers, and again, I think it's all, senior managers in the federal public service and most provincial ones never read journal articles. And I said, I read one when I was doing my master's because my supervisor made me. And one of the great things about graduating from a master's at the University of Ottawa, I thought, great, I never have to read another journal article in my life. And I almost made it. Like, I'm still alive and I've read a few now. But really, the level of influence between that and decision-making and protected area stuff, pretty low. Most protected area managers that I've worked with, and when I was one myself, really find that hosting researchers and maintaining infrastructure, it's expensive, it's time-consuming, it's really just a giant pain in the neck. And so one of the things I used to kind of delight in when I would go and I would visit various field sites of the agency I was part of, and I'd say, I've noticed that there's a whole pile of ecosystem questions and concerts and things here and so on. We could study the following things. And I would get very enthused by this because I'm kind of enthused by that sort of stuff generally, but I thought it was a really good idea. I think most of my ideas are. And so I'd stand there and go, let's do this, this, and this. And almost every time I'd get this sort of thing, boss, that is a fantastic idea. I wish we'd thought of it before. Totally unconnected from that. I'm just worried you might miss your flight. Because, the distance from here to the airport is actually a little far and it's going to take a while. I wouldn't want you to miss it. So why don't we just go now? And hope I would just go away and not come back. Because an awful lot of that kind of stuff is just viewed as this huge sort of pain in the neck, right? And so innovation is not really part of my job either. Being a protected area manager is an incredibly difficult job that very, very, very few people in my experience understand. An awful lot of people say, how hard could it be? There's a big circle on the map, tell people what they can't do and can do, call it a day. Think about, in just the national park context, if I could for a second, to be a little parochial. They're responsible for staff, budgets, all kinds of operational stuff. They deal with mayors, reeves, First Nation leaders, visitors. In several parks, they deal with town sites. They own the town. On and on and on and on it goes. And if you did a survey, I've done this, of national park superintendents and said, what's the number one emotion that you associate with the condition of your job on an ongoing basis? All of them will say, I'm lonely. They all feel like I'm out there on an island all by myself with crocodiles all around me and so on. It's a desperately lonely job and extremely difficult. And so when you think about that, not too many of them are going to say, but I wouldn't mind sort of demonstrating broader ecosystem and conservation stuff, or I'd like to get on the climate change train and really that sort of stuff. It's not going to happen. And so I think that what happens is we tend to view protected areas as a means for protecting nature and nature experiences. They're not really viewed enough as social assets, at least in my opinion anyway, drivers of change. Okay, so if you go back down then for our last little bit of our vision on decision making and so on, protected area managers, as I said, are accountable for everything in their park. Sharing decision making authority is rarely a recipe for making decision making easier, right? Dictatorships are horrible and awful and so on. For the dictator, they're pretty good. And so if you're in a position where you can, sharing all this is not going to make my life a lot easier. And so there's a bit of an instinctive reaction against that. I'm not aware of any law that says something like the minister shall put in place collaborative governance arrangement mechanisms either just with Indigenous people or with local folks around and so on. If it exists, I haven't seen it. And again, I'm certain there is one somewhere. But generally speaking, the law is not pushing people towards this kind of stuff. And the shared governance literature that I have read, Derek Harmon made me, is often long on theory. It's pretty darn short on practice, and so often I find myself going, oh, I printed this wrong. The conclusions are all missing. And I kind of get to the end and I kind of go, the end of the paper fell off. And so you kind of go, So where does that leave us all then? So I think that the road ahead, I'd say anyway, is pretty clear in terms of elements of the shared vision, right? See the road ahead. Public and political support for protected areas, I think, is at an all-time high. Certainly since when I started in what I think is the conservation movement in 1980, 42 years ago now, I've never seen as much support for protected areas as we see now, which I think is pretty good. But there are some pretty formidable challenges ahead of us. I'm convinced that most protected area managers and people in leadership are committed to making the programs better and more effective, but we need to reduce some of the systemic challenges in front of them for doing so. And so I'm just going to flip through those quickly. I think we need to revisit the nature of the visitor experience. This picture is taken in 1924. The roots of visitor experience are very, very deep. People have been going, I never understand why people do this. They all go and they get in their bathing suits, sometimes not even that, and they sit in really hot water and float for a while. I just don't get it. But anyway, people love it. They've been doing it for a long time. And the visitor number needs, at least in my view, need to be considered as limits. I just don't think we can say we're open until we're not. And we're starting to see that in some parks now. Certain experiences, I've got a real bias here. I think some of them should just be banned and just stop the debate. I don't think we should have new trams in Banff, for example, which is one of the big proposals. Take a big tram from downtown Banff and drive it or fly it, whatever you do, across the Trans-Canada Highway to Northway Mountains. Oh, yeah. I think we should just say, nope. And I have lots of words I use when I think of that, and a couple of them rhyme with the word truck. And so I think that the expansion of the visitor footprint should just be not considered. And I also think very much along the theme that Liz talked about, we can use much more energy and attention, I think, to communicating on things outside. I really think that user fee reform is critical. We've got a whole pile of private assets in public resources that are making a fortune at almost low cost. And we could talk about that for a very long time. It's just not right. Okay. I think what we also need to do is fix what we have and put out the fires. So when you've got this decrepit, broken down kind of house that I've got in the picture here, I don't think you'd look at that and say, hey, Betty, let's put on a new wing. Nope. I think that we need to fix what we've got, and chronic underinvestment in infrastructure has led to substantial decay in the protected area systems. Fundraising campaigns, political attention, it's all on very, very rarely on operations and maintenance, right? Because it just bores you to death. And most protected areas sit there, and managers, I think, anyway, sit there, well, this is great that we're going to double the amount of money in new park establishment, and I can't flush the toilets. Right? The house is burning down, but we're going to go and do other things. And I think we have to do that because they're vital and essential to program integrity. And I think that data collection and monitoring have to be reconceptualized as part of just core business. It's not something, when you get everything done and so on, let's go monitor something. No, it has to be part of it, I think, as part of that sort of core thing. This unbelievably cool slide, just keep clicking through because I learned a few months ago how to use animations, and these are fantastic. You know, if you look at law reform, and okay, I'm going to wind up, they're absolutely critical from the point of view of what we need. If you think about all those things, if we hit the sweet spot in the middle, where we get values, programs, and norms lined up in that, if you just keep clicking until you get a red arrow coming down, just click your fingers off. And so just watch that one move around, groovy kind of thing, and then the arrow goes right down, sweet spot, right? And so if you go to the next slide there, our legal regime is not there. Our legal regime is very much constituted with legislation written a very, very long time ago, some of it even before I was born, if you can believe it. Very few of the modern mission elements I talked about are there, and bureaucracies, I think, are very good at getting things done if they get told to do it. They're not getting told to do all of those sorts of things. And bottom line on that slide is that we need to change the legislative base. So if you just go down. Okay. So one final on the next slide there, if you just go through it, so there's a vanity shot. This is me just outside of Saskatoon about 3 weeks ago. From this one spot in the field, I saw click. I saw willets. I saw yellowlegs, I saw godwits, sanderlings, sandpipers, avocets, and I saw 8 whooping cranes. There are only 532 in the world. Saw them all standing there, right, and so on. And if you click to the next one there, none of them are in a protected area. And so from my point of view, they're all in highly threatened areas. Their halting biodiversity decline, in my view, really requires paying attention to those areas. We should always ask protected from what, as we're looking at protected area, particular expansion. And I don't think more is necessarily the better. I think our obsessive focus on spatial targets right now is distracting us from a lot of that stuff. I think one of the big reasons we don't have the investments in infrastructure that we need is because people are focused on expanding the system. They're not putting out the fires and fixing the windows and so on. And so I believe that we need to deploy much more diverse surgical protection measures to halt the decline of biodiversity in absolutely critical and critically threatened areas. So I think, to sum up at long last, so that Steve can get me to sit down, if we're going to protect biodiversity, I think together we can energize investments in a modern stewardship of our system. We can more effectively protect habitat. We can recalibrate our views on how we use protected areas. We can reform our laws to make them more modern and to support more modern management. And we can put a smile back in the space. Thanks very much for listening. Bye. I have a thank you slide.
Thank you, Trevor. We're going to take a break for about half an hour now, and we do have time a little bit late in the afternoon. We do have a roundtable discussion, actually, so if there are questions, I think we can pick some of them up at that point. I do want to give people both on the sort of call a little bit of a chance to relax a little bit, and for those in the room, actually, as well. So we'll resume in about half an hour with Catherine's talk. That'll take us into the lunch break again for those at home, as well as for those in the room here. So I will stop recording as we're here. So for those of you who look at this later, won't see like a half an hour sort of long sort of, nothing. We'll then resume that with Catherine's talk and record at that point. Again, thanks to our two speakers this morning for starting off and for keeping us on time. Thank you very much. And we'll resume in a bit. Thank you.